If you've ever been blamed for something you didn't do by the people who actually did it, hit that like button and subscribe right now. You're not going to want to miss what happened next. My name is Victoria Chin, and my family sued me for $2.8 million they claimed I stole from our family business. The irony? There was no family business. Not a legitimate one anyway. Let me back up. I'm the youngest of 4 children in the Chin family. My older siblings, brother David, sister Michelle, and sister Karen, were the golden trio. They all went into finance, all married well, all lived in the same exclusive suburb outside Seattle. They played golf together, vacationed together, invested together. I was the odd one out. I became a non-profit financial analyst, working for organizations that provided microloans to underserved communities. I made $73,000 a year. Comfortable but nothing spectacular. I lived in a modest condo in the city, drove a 7-year-old Subaru, and spent my weekends volunteering at financial literacy workshops. My family found this embarrassing. Victoria works with poor people, my mother would explain at family gatherings, her voice dripping with barely concealed disappointment. She could have worked at Goldman Sachs, but she chose charity. The truth was more complicated. I'd actually received offers from 3 major investment banks after getting my MBA from Wharton. But I'd also seen what the 2008 financial crisis did to regular people, and I'd decided to use my skills differently. My family never understood that choice. To them, money was the only measure of success, and by their standards I was a failure. What they didn't know was that I'd been building something extraordinary for the past 8 years. Something that would eventually expose everything they'd been hiding. It started innocently enough. 5 years ago, my uncle Richard, my father's brother, called me in a panic. He was dying of pancreatic cancer and wanted to talk about his estate. "Victoria," he said, his voice weak, "I need your help. But you can't tell your father or siblings. Promise me." I promised. Uncle Richard had been the family's quiet millionaire. While my father and siblings flaunted their wealth, Uncle Richard had lived modestly and invested brilliantly. He owned a portfolio of dividend-paying stocks worth approximately $8.7 million. "Your father has been pressuring me to invest in their ventures," Uncle Richard explained during our meeting at his attorney's office. "But something's not right, Victoria. The numbers don't make sense. The returns they claim are mathematically impossible. I think they're running some kind of scheme." He slid a folder across the table. Inside were investment prospectuses, financial statements, and tax documents from something called Chin Family Capital Partners. I'd never heard of it. "They told me it's a private family investment fund," Uncle Richard said. 23% annual returns, guaranteed. "They want me to invest my entire portfolio. But Victoria, no legitimate investment generates guaranteed returns like that. It's either fraud or money laundering, and I think it's both." I spent 3 weeks analyzing the documents Uncle Richard had given me. What I found made my blood run cold. Chin Family Capital Partners was supposedly a real estate investment fund run by my brother David, with my sisters Michelle and Karen as partners. According to their materials, they'd been generating consistent 23% returns for 7 years by identifying undervalued properties and maximizing rental income. But the numbers told a different story. The properties they claimed to own didn't exist at several of the addresses listed. The rental income they reported was 3 times higher than market rates for comparable properties. The management fees they charged were extraordinary, 42% of all invested capital annually. Most damning, the money coming in from new investors exactly matched the returns being paid to existing investors, minus those management fees. It was a textbook Ponzi scheme, layered with what appeared to be money laundering through fake property transactions. Uncle Richard had been right to be suspicious. "What do you want me to do?" I asked him. "I want you to have everything," he said simply. "Every stock, every bond, every asset. It's all going to you, Victoria. Because you're the only one in this family with integrity." "Uncle Richard, that's almost $9 million. I know exactly what it is. And I know exactly what they'll do if they get their hands on it. They'll pour it into their scheme, lose it all, and blame you somehow." His eyes were fierce despite his illness. "Promise me you'll take it. Promise me you'll use it to do good. And promise me you'll stop them before they hurt anyone else." I promised. Uncle Richard died 3 weeks later. His will was ironclad, everything to me, with a specific clause stating that the bequest was made in recognition of Victoria's integrity and with full knowledge that other family members are specifically excluded due to concerns about financial impropriety. The will was read privately per Uncle Richard's instructions. My family didn't even know about the inheritance for 6 months. During those 6 months, I worked with Uncle Richard's attorney, Harold Stevenson, and a forensic accountant named Dr. Patricia Wong to analyze Chin Family Capital Partners in depth. What we discovered was worse than I'd imagined. While my family thought I was struggling along on my nonprofit salary, I was actually building something extraordinary. The $8.7 million from Uncle Richard had been invested carefully and ethically. Working with a wealth management firm that specialized in impact investing, I'd grown it to $11.3 million in 5 years. The portfolio generated approximately $385,000 in annual income, which I used to fund microfinance initiatives and financial literacy programs. But more importantly, I'd used those resources to investigate my family's operation. Dr. Patricia Wong's forensic analysis revealed the full scope of Chin Family Capital Partners. Total invested by victims: $47.3 million over 7 years. The victims included 17 elderly investors who'd been told their retirement funds would be protected and grown, 8 churches and nonprofits that had invested endowment funds, 23 individual investors, mostly family friends and business associates, 2 small pension funds. Actual assets under management: $8.2 million. Where had the rest gone? $23.1 million paid to early investors as fake returns, classic Ponzi structure. $12.7 million in management fees, paid to David, Michelle, and Karen. $3.3 million in luxury purchases: David's vacation home in Maui, Michelle's boat, Karen's art collection, my parents' European river cruise tours. The money laundering component: David had created 17 shell companies with legitimate-sounding names like Pacific Northwest Property Holdings LLC and Cascade Real Estate Development Corporation. Money would flow from Chin Family Capital Partners to these shells for property acquisitions that never happened. The shells would then transfer money back to my siblings as consulting fees or property management income. This structure allowed them to report legitimate-looking business income on tax returns, hide the Ponzi scheme structure, launder money from unknown sources we suspected but couldn't prove connections to organized crime, criminal exposure, wire fraud, federal crime 20 years maximum, securities fraud, federal crime 20 years maximum, money laundering, federal crime 20 years maximum, tax evasion, federal crime 5 years maximum, elder abuse, state crime 4 years maximum. Dr. Wong estimated my siblings faced 40 to 60 years in federal prison if convicted on all counts. I'd spent 3 years gathering evidence, not planning to destroy my family, but preparing to protect the victims when the scheme inevitably collapsed. Then my family found out about Uncle Richard's inheritance. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I'd managed to keep Uncle Richard's bequest quiet for almost 6 months. But in a family as nosy as mine, secrets don't last forever. My cousin Jennifer, Aunt Sarah's daughter, worked at a bank and noticed my name on some trust documents. She called my mother immediately. The family meeting was called for a Saturday in March. I was requested to attend at my parents' house. When I arrived, all of them were there. My parents Robert and Linda, siblings David, Michelle, and Karen with their spouses, and Aunt Sarah. They were sitting in the formal living room like a corporate board meeting. My father didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We know about Uncle Richard's will," he said coldly. $8.7 million all to you. We want to discuss the distribution." "There's nothing to discuss," I said calmly. Uncle Richard left his estate to me. His decision was clear and legally binding. "He was dying of cancer," my mother protested. "He wasn't in his right mind. You must have manipulated him." "He was evaluated by 2 separate physicians and deemed fully competent," I interrupted. "Harold Stevenson made sure every legal requirement was met. The will is uncontestable." David leaned forward, his investment banker smile firmly in place. "Victoria, be reasonable. We're family. Uncle Richard would have wanted his wealth to benefit everyone, not just you. The fair thing would be to divide it equally among all the siblings. If Uncle Richard wanted that, he would have written that into his will," I said. He specifically chose not to. Michelle's voice turned sharp. And why do you think that was? What lies did you tell him about us? I didn't tell him anything. He drew his own conclusions based on your behavior. Karen slammed her hand on the coffee table. This is ridiculous. You work for a nonprofit making $70,000 a year. You have no idea how to manage that kind of wealth. You'll lose it all within 2 years. The smart thing would be to invest it with Chin Family Capital Partners. We'd guarantee you 23% annual returns. No, I said simply. The room fell silent. No. David's smile faded. Victoria, we're offering to help you. I don't want your help. And I'm not investing a single dollar with Chin Family Capital Partners. My father's face turned red. That's disrespectful and stupid. Your brother has built something remarkable. His fund has outperformed the market for 7 consecutive years. Has it? I asked quietly. Or have you been paying old investors with new investors' money? The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. What did you just say? David's voice was dangerous. I said your returns are mathematically impossible. I said your property holdings don't match county records. I said your fee structure is designed to extract maximum capital from investors. I said it looks like a Ponzi scheme. Michelle stood up. You ungrateful bitch. I'm done here, I said standing. Uncle Richard left his money to me and I'm keeping it. If you want to contest the will, hire a lawyer. But you won't win. I walked out while they were still shouting at me. That was when they made their fatal mistake. Instead of letting it go, they decided to destroy me. 2 months later, I was served with legal papers. David Chin, Michelle Chin Morrison, Karen Chin White, Robert Chin, and Linda Chin versus Victoria Chin. The lawsuit claimed I had fraudulently manipulated Uncle Richard into changing his will. Stolen $2.8 million from family business accounts over the past 5 years. Engaged in identity theft by opening accounts in David's name. Committed tax fraud by hiding income. The damages they sought. $2.8 million in stolen funds, plus $5 million in punitive damages, plus Uncle Richard's entire $8.7 million inheritance. Total, $16.5 million. The evidence they planned to present included bank statements showing transfers from Chin Family Capital Partners to accounts in my name. Emails allegedly from me requesting access to family business accounts. Tax documents showing I'd hidden income. Testimony from family members about my suspicious behavior. Forensic accounting showing systematic theft. It was brilliant, really. They'd fabricated evidence that I had stolen from their Ponzi scheme, which would both discredit me and provide cover for their operation. There was just one problem. I'd been preparing for exactly this scenario for 3 years. The moment I received the lawsuit, I called 3 people. First, Harold Stevenson, Uncle Richard's attorney, who'd anticipated this lawsuit and had been helping me prepare. Second, Dr. Patricia Wong, whose forensic accounting report was now 327 pages of documented fraud. Third, Special Agent Michael Torres of the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, who'd been building a case against Chin Family Capital Partners for 18 months. Yes, I'd been working with the FBI. After Dr. Wong's initial analysis revealed the scope of the fraud, I'd contacted the FBI's Seattle field office. Agent Torres had been investigating investment fraud and was very interested in a Ponzi scheme involving $47.3 million. For 18 months, I'd been providing the FBI with evidence. Complete financial records from Chin Family Capital Partners. Shell company formation documents. Wire transfer records. Emails between my siblings discussing the scheme. Recordings of investor meetings where they made fraudulent promises. Testimony from Uncle Richard, recorded before his death. The FBI had been building a RICO case, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act. This wasn't just fraud, it was organized criminal enterprise. But they'd been waiting for the right moment to move. My family's lawsuit provided that moment. See, the evidence they planned to present in civil court would document their own criminal activity. The bank statements showing transfers to accounts in my name? Those accounts didn't exist. They'd fabricated the statements. The emails from me? Forgeries which we could prove through digital forensics. The tax documents? More fabrications. Every piece of evidence they'd created to frame me was actually a new federal crime. Obstruction of justice, perjury, falsifying documents, fraud upon the court. Agent Torres was delighted. Let them present their evidence in court, he said. Let them commit perjury under oath. Let them document their own crimes. Then we'll arrest them in the courtroom. So I prepared differently than they expected. While they were creating fake evidence, I was working with 3 separate forensic document examiners to prove their evidence was fabricated. Compiling complete transaction histories showing I'd never touched their accounts. Gathering testimony from the 17 elderly victims they'd defrauded. Organizing the FBI's evidence into a presentation for the judge. Coordinating with federal prosecutors on the timing of arrests. My lawyer, Elizabeth Park, was a former federal prosecutor who specialized in white-collar crime. She'd taken my case pro bono after reviewing Dr. Wong's report. This is the most clear-cut fraud case I've seen in 15 years, Elizabeth said. Your family isn't just going to lose this lawsuit. They're going to prison. The trial was scheduled for September 15th. I was ready. Hit that subscribe button if you've ever been falsely accused by people who were guilty themselves, because what happened next was justice. The courtroom was packed. My family had made sure of that. They'd invited extended family, business associates, and friends to witness my public humiliation. My parents sat in the front row of the gallery, looking grim and righteous. Aunt Sarah sat beside them, already dabbing her eyes with a tissue. Various cousins, family friends, and business associates filled the remaining seats. I sat at the defendant's table with Elizabeth Park. We had 3 large file boxes with us, meticulously organized and labeled. At the plaintiff's table, my siblings sat with their attorney, Richard Manning, a corporate lawyer who clearly had no idea what he'd walked into. Judge Sandra Williams entered and we all rose. She was a no-nonsense former prosecutor known for her sharp mind and low tolerance for courtroom theatrics. Be seated, Judge Williams said. Mr. Manning, you may call your first witness. Your Honor, the plaintiffs call David Chin. My brother took the stand looking confident in his custom Tom Ford suit. He was sworn in and settled into the witness chair like he owned it. Manning walked him through the basics, his credentials, MBA from Stanford, 15 years in finance, his role as founder of Chin Family Capital Partners, his reputation for ethical high-return investing. Then they got to the meat of it. Mr. Chin, can you explain your relationship with the defendant, Victoria Chin? She's my younger sister, David said, his voice heavy with disappointment. I've always tried to help her despite her career choices. When she struggled financially, I gave her access to some of our family business accounts so she could learn about real investing. This was a lie. I'd never had access to any of their accounts. And what happened with that access? Manning asked. Over a period of 5 years, Victoria systematically stole $2.8 million from Chin Family Capital Partners. She created fake invoices, falsified transactions, and transferred money to accounts she'd opened in my name to hide the theft. Gasps from the gallery. My mother shook her head sadly. Aunt Sarah clutched her pearls. Do you have evidence of this theft? Manning asked. I do. David pulled out a thick folder. Bank statements showing the transfers. Emails from Victoria requesting access. Transaction records. All of it documented. Manning entered the documents as exhibits and handed copies to the judge. Elizabeth didn't object. She just sat calmly beside me making notes. Mr. Chin, Manning continued, why didn't you report this theft to the police? Because she's family, David said, his voice breaking slightly. I kept hoping she'd return the money. I kept giving her chances to make it right. But she refused. She even manipulated our dying uncle into leaving his entire estate to her, cutting out everyone else. That's when I knew we had to take legal action. More gasps. Someone in the gallery actually said, how terrible. No further questions, Manning said. Elizabeth stood slowly. She adjusted her glasses and smiled pleasantly at David. Mr. Chin, you testified that Chin Family Capital Partners generates 23% annual returns. Is that correct? Yes, David said confidently. And you've maintained this return rate for 7 consecutive years? Yes. How many assets under management does the fund currently have? David hesitated for just a second. Approximately 47 million. And the fund's investment strategy is primarily real estate focused? That's correct. We identify undervalued properties, acquire them, and maximize rental income. Elizabeth nodded. Can you provide the court with a list of properties currently owned by Chin Family Capital Partners? Another hesitation. That information is proprietary. Your Honor, Elizabeth said, I'm simply asking for a list of properties. Surely ownership records are public information. Judge Williams looked at David. Mr. Chin, provide the list. David's lawyer leaned over and whispered something. David nodded. We own 17 properties across Washington, Oregon, and California. Could you name them? I don't have the addresses memorized. Surely you remember at least one property from a $47 million portfolio? The courtroom was silent. David's confident smile was starting to crack. The Pacific Northwest Property Holdings building in Tacoma, he finally said. Elizabeth pulled out a document. According to the Pierce County Assessor's Office, there is no property owned by Pacific Northwest Property Holdings in Tacoma. In fact, Pacific Northwest Property Holdings LLC was dissolved in 2021 for failure to file required reports. She slid the document to the judge. Let me ask you differently, Mr. Chin. Does Chin Family Capital Partners actually own any real property? We own properties through subsidiary companies. How many of those subsidiary companies exist? 17. And how many actual properties do those 17 companies own? David's face was turning red. I'd need to check the records. I'll help you, Elizabeth said. She pulled out another thick folder. We've contacted every county assessor's office in Washington, Oregon, and California. We've searched every property database. We've checked every LLC registration. Your 17 subsidiary companies own exactly 0 properties. She handed the report to the judge and to Manning, who was now looking very concerned. So if Chin Family Capital Partners doesn't own any real estate, where does the money come from? Elizabeth asked. From investor capital and returns. Returns from what, if there are no properties generating rental income? David's mouth opened and closed. His attorney was frantically whispering to him. Mr. Chin, isn't it true that Chin Family Capital Partners is actually a Ponzi scheme? That you pay early investors with money from new investors? That the 23% returns are mathematically impossible because there are no actual investments generating income? That's a lie. David shouted. We have legitimate investments. Then why do the payments to investors exactly match the deposits from new investors, minus your 42% management fee? Elizabeth pulled out banking records, the real ones obtained through FBI subpoena. These records show that in 2022, you received $8.3 million from new investors. You paid out $4.8 million to existing investors as returns. The remaining $3.5 million went to management fees paid to you, Michelle Chin Morrison and Karen Chin White. There were no property acquisitions. No legitimate investments. Just money moving in circles while you extracted fees. The courtroom erupted. Judge Williams banged her gavel. David was gripping the witness stand, his knuckles white. Those are confidential records, you can't. They were obtained through federal subpoena, Elizabeth said calmly. Because the FBI has been investigating Chin Family Capital Partners for 18 months. At that moment the courtroom doors opened. Special Agent Michael Torres entered, flanked by 6 other FBI agents and 2 SEC investigators. Aunt Sarah made a choking sound and collapsed in her seat. Your Honor, Agent Torres said, showing his badge, I apologize for the interruption. We have federal warrants for the arrest of David Chin, Michelle Chin Morrison, Karen Chin White, Robert Chin, and Linda Chin. Chaos erupted. My mother screamed. Michelle tried to run and was blocked by an agent. Karen was crying. My father stood up, shouting about his rights. Judge Williams banged her gavel repeatedly. Order. Order in this court. The agents moved efficiently. David was pulled from the witness stand and handcuffed. Michelle and Karen were cuffed at the plaintiff's table. My parents were cuffed in the gallery. David Chin, you are under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, and racketeering, Agent Torres said, reading from a card. Michelle Chin Morrison, Karen Chin White, Robert Chin, Linda Chin. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. You have the right to remain silent. As the agents led my family out of the courtroom in handcuffs, I sat quietly at the defense table. Several family members in the gallery were screaming at me, calling me a traitor, a liar, a monster. Judge Williams banged her gavel one final time. "Everyone will be seated and silent, or I will hold you in contempt." The room quieted. My family was gone, led away by federal agents. "Your Honor," Elizabeth said, "in light of these arrests, I move to dismiss the plaintiff's case." "Motion granted," Judge Williams said immediately. She looked at the remaining members of the gallery, the extended family and friends who'd come to watch my humiliation. "This court is adjourned." As people filed out, many of them glaring at me, Elizabeth began packing our files. "You okay?" she asked quietly. I nodded. I was shaking slightly, but I was okay. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Dr. Wong. 17 victims have been contacted. Restitution process beginning. You did the right thing. I had done the right thing. It just didn't feel good. The arrests made national news within hours. Seattle family arrested in $47 million Ponzi scheme, read the headline in the Seattle Times. The article detailed how Chin Family Capital Partners had defrauded elderly investors, churches and pension funds over 7 years. Within 24 hours, all 5 family members were denied bail. Federal prosecutors argued they were flight risks with access to hidden assets. They remained in federal custody. The SEC froze all accounts associated with Chin Family Capital Partners and the 17 shell companies. This included my siblings' personal accounts, my parents' accounts, and any jointly held assets. News outlets descended on the story. It had everything: wealthy family, massive fraud, courtroom arrests. My siblings' photos were on every local news broadcast. The $8.2 million in actual assets was frozen for victim restitution. It wasn't nearly enough to cover the $47.3 million invested, but it was a start. Within 48 hours, Michelle's husband filed for divorce, citing fraud and deception. Karen's husband did the same. Both men claimed they'd had no knowledge of the scheme and were protecting their own assets. David's vacation home in Maui was seized by the FBI. Michelle's boat was seized. Karen's art collection was seized. Everything was being sold for victim restitution. My parents' home, a 5,000 square foot estate in Medina worth $3.2 million, was seized. They'd purchased it partially with fraud proceeds. 17 victims filed a class action lawsuit seeking full restitution plus damages. Several elderly victims gave tearful interviews about losing their life savings. Within 1 week, the U.S. Attorney's Office announced a 47-count indictment against all 5 defendants. Charges included wire fraud, multiple counts, securities fraud, multiple counts, money laundering, multiple counts, conspiracy, elder abuse, and racketeering. If convicted on all counts, each defendant faced 60 to 80 years in federal prison. David's wife filed for divorce. In her filing, she claimed she'd discovered he'd been having an affair with a client, gambling heavily, and hiding debts exceeding $800,000. The Washington State Bar Association opened an ethics investigation into my siblings' attorney, Richard Manning, for his role in presenting fabricated evidence. Within 30 days, plea negotiations began. Federal prosecutors offered deals: plead guilty to fraud and conspiracy, cooperate fully, serve 15 to 20 years with possibility of parole. My siblings refused. They still believed they could win at trial, that they could claim Victoria had fabricated everything, that a jury would believe them over the FBI. My parents took the deal. They pled guilty and agreed to testify against their children. They were sentenced to 8 years each in federal prison. The forensic document examiners confirmed that every piece of evidence my family had presented in their lawsuit against me was fabricated. The emails were forged. The bank statements were fake. The tax documents were falsified. Manning withdrew from the case, claiming his clients had lied to him. He cooperated with authorities to avoid disbarment and prosecution. 3 months later, the trial began. It lasted 6 weeks. I attended every day, sitting in the gallery while prosecutors presented the evidence I'd helped gather. The elderly victims testified. One woman, 79-year-old Margaret Flores, cried as she described losing her $340,000 retirement fund. A church pastor explained how they'd invested their $580,000 building fund and lost everything. Dr. Wong testified for 3 days, walking the jury through every fraudulent transaction, every fake property, every dollar that had been stolen and laundered. My parents testified against their children, describing years of fraud, lies, and manipulation. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. Guilty on all counts. 6 months later, sentencing day arrived. David Chin, 25 years in federal prison, full restitution ordered. Michelle Chin Morrison, 22 years in federal prison, full restitution ordered. Karen Chin White, 20 years in federal prison, full restitution ordered. They were all in their mid-40s. They'd be in their late 60s or early 70s before they were released. My parents, already sentenced, were in separate federal facilities serving their 8-year terms. The extended family that had packed the courtroom to watch my humiliation? They stopped speaking to me. I was a traitor who'd sent my own family to prison. I didn't care. While my family's world burned, I focused on what mattered: the victims. The asset recovery process took 18 months. Between seized accounts, sold properties, and clawback lawsuits against people who'd received fraudulent returns, we recovered approximately $31.4 million of the $47.3 million invested. It wasn't full restitution, but it was substantial. Many victims recovered 60 to 70% of their investments. For the elderly victims who'd lost the most, I did something else. I used $2.3 million from Uncle Richard's inheritance to create a victim assistance fund. It wasn't restitution. Legally, I had no obligation to these people. But morally, I felt responsible. If I'd gone to the FBI earlier, maybe fewer people would have been hurt. Margaret Flores, the 79-year-old who'd testified, received $85,000 from the fund, enough to close the gap in her retirement savings. The church that lost their building fund received $180,000. 15 other victims received payments ranging from $30,000 to $150,000. I also continued growing Uncle Richard's portfolio ethically. Working with my impact investment advisors, I'd grown it to $13.8 million. The annual income, now approximately $470,000, funded microfinance initiatives and financial literacy programs. We launched a program specifically teaching people how to recognize investment fraud. We used Chin Family Capital Partners as a case study. What the red flags were, how the scheme worked, why the returns were impossible. If even one person avoided fraud because of that program, Uncle Richard's legacy would have done what he'd hoped: stopped people from being hurt. My nonprofit work flourished. I was promoted to Director of Financial Education, with a salary of $124,000. I gave speeches at conferences about fraud prevention. I wrote articles about ethical investing. I built a career I was proud of. And I built a chosen family. My mentor, Dr. Wong, became like an aunt to me. Harold Stevenson, Uncle Richard's attorney, treated me like a daughter. I made friends in the victim advocacy community, the nonprofit sector, the ethical investing world. These were people who valued integrity over wealth, who measured success by impact rather than income, who understood that doing the right thing sometimes meant making hard choices. I also met someone, a legal aid attorney named Marcus, who'd been helping some of the fraud victims with their restitution claims. We bonded over our shared commitment to justice. We got married 2 years after the trial in a small ceremony with 50 guests. Not one member of my biological family was invited. 3 years after the arrests, I received a letter from David in federal prison. It was 8 pages of rage, blame, and bitterness. He claimed I'd destroyed the family, that I'd been jealous of their success, that I was a traitor who chose strangers over blood. He demanded I use Uncle Richard's inheritance to hire appeals attorneys for him and our sisters. He said if I had any decency, any family loyalty, I'd help them. I burned the letter without finishing it. 6 months later, Michelle wrote. Her letter was different, apologetic, reflective. She claimed prison had given her time to think, to realize what they'd done was wrong, to understand the harm they'd caused. She asked for forgiveness. Not for money or help with appeals, but just forgiveness. I thought about it for a long time. I discussed it with my therapist, with Marcus, with Dr. Wong. Then I wrote back, I accept your apology. I hope you use your remaining time in prison to become someone who would deserve forgiveness. But I don't want a relationship with you. What you did wasn't just fraud. It was a betrayal of every value that matters to me. I hope you find peace, but you'll find it without me. My mother wrote from prison too, multiple times. Her letters alternated between self-pity and rage. Some days I was her ungrateful daughter who'd betrayed the family. Other days I was her only hope, the one who could fix everything. I never responded. If you've ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right, tell me your story in the comments. What would you have done in my situation? Does any of this feel familiar? Because if you've been there, if you've ever discovered that the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally were actually willing to destroy you to protect themselves, I want you to know something important. You're not the villain for refusing to be complicit. You're not a traitor for choosing integrity over loyalty. You're not responsible for the consequences they face for their own choices. My family made their decisions. They chose fraud over honesty. They chose greed over ethics. They chose to frame me rather than face accountability. I chose differently. I chose the victims over the perpetrators. I chose justice over family loyalty. I chose to build a life based on integrity rather than blood ties. Uncle Richard was right about everything. He knew who his family really was, and he trusted me to do what needed to be done. I wake up every morning in a home I share with someone who loves me for who I am, knowing my work helps people avoid the fraud that destroyed so many lives. I manage investments that honor my uncle's legacy. I run programs that teach people to protect themselves. My siblings wake up in federal prison cells, serving decades for crimes they still won't fully acknowledge. My parents wake up in prison too, having chosen to testify against their children to save a few years of their sentences. The extended family that condemned me? Several are now being investigated for accepting fraudulent returns. They knew the numbers were impossible. They chose not to ask questions. That's not revenge. That's just consequences. And consequences, as Uncle Richard would say, are the truest test of character. His test revealed who my family really was. Revealed who I was too. And I'm grateful for that clarity, even though it cost me everything I thought was family. Because what I built instead, a life of purpose, a chosen family of people who share my values, a legacy of helping rather than harming, that's worth more than any amount of money or any connection by blood. Uncle Richard's final gift wasn't the $8.7 million. It was the opportunity to see the truth and the courage to act on it. And that's a legacy I'll spend the rest of my life honoring.